Chapter 6, this is a pretty important one because not only we're going to be developing our floor plan, but we're going to be going over the wall tool and all the nuances for it. To start this chapter, we're going to need to go into our floor plan levels, starting with level 1, and we're going to be using a lot of the wall tool. I do want to advise to make things a little bit easier. Although the chapter does start on page 6-25, and then they provide us some exceptional conceptual sketches provided by the architect and interior designer on page 626 and 6-27, you'll actually really want to refer to the more technical drawings that are provided a little bit later. So page 6-29 is going to show you the west side of the building and the dimensions that you'll need to follow. And then page 6-30 is going to show you the east side of the first floor. Page 6-31 is going to show you the west side of the interior walls for the second floor. And then 6-32 is going to show you the east side, particularly the northeast side of what's going on floor 2. On page 6-35, you will see the southeast end of the corner of level 2, where we're going to make our adjustments for there. So those 5 pages, 6-29 to 6-32, and then 6-35 are going to be your go-to references for this chapter. So make sure you're referring back to those as you're creating your walls. But before we get into even looking at where the walls need to be going, you need to make sure that once you get that wall tool going, as you're seeing on page 6-25 at the bottom, a great tip for developing your walls is before you worry about drawing them whatsoever, make sure that the draw style that you're wanting to do, which is just the shape of the wall that you're going to be drawing, is set. Make sure that your options are set, particularly that location line, which is the part of the wall that you'll be drawing with when you draw a line. Your wall type is selected, and your constraints, which is the bottoms and tops of your wall, are set. Many of these things can be changed and fixed after you already draw the wall, but it is always going to be more time consuming to place the wall incorrectly when you had the opportunity to set some of those settings prior to drawing them, especially if you have multiple walls that are going to have the same consistent but non-defaulted constraints. In this case, we start with a generic wall, and it has a base constraint to level 1, but then it just goes 20 feet into the air, and we're not going to want either of those things. We're going to want our walls to go up to level 2 from the top constraint, which we can also set up here. And then the wall type that we're going to want is not a generic wall. These carry no information and are generally useless in Revit. So we're going to be using the interior 4 7/8 inch partition, 1 hour with a 1 hour fire separation, to draw our interior walls. Also, as advised, we're going to want to set the detail level to coarse because we're not going to care necessarily about the entire assembly of the walls. We're just going to ensure that when we're drawing our walls based on their centerline locations, that we'll be able to see them more easily. So now that I've got my wall tool going and I've got it drawn in the right style, and I have the right type selected and the correct constraints selected and the correct location line of wall center line selected, I can now use page 6-29 and 6-30 to start on my walls for level 1. Now there's 2 different ways to go about actually drawing and placing the walls in their correct position, and in my opinion, neither of them are necessarily better than the other, although I have my own preferences. The first way that you can do it is ensure that while you're drawing the wall, you are drawing it in the correct locations, which you can generally do whenever you are using the temporary dimensions to set your locations. But that also requires you to A, make sure that your temporary dimensions are going to the correct location, which you can change in the Manage Additional Settings, Annotations, Temporary Dimensions Location. You can tell your temporary dimensions which part of the wall you're wanting it to reference. But also you'll just sort of be relying on your temporary dimensions, always referencing the part of the building that you want to draw your wall from. As you can tell from my reluctancy, in my opinion, I feel like that is a little tedious of a method for drawing the walls. My preferred method is to look at the walls as they're supposed to be, or in a real life condition where you may not be given all of your interior walls. Just draw the walls approximately where you think they'll go and then adjust them later. In support of that, Revit's actual full name that it was shortened down from is Revise Instantly. And I believe that is one of the biggest reasons that it got that name is because Revit was meant to be drawn in certain ways, and whether or not you are just doing some quick sketching and then moving things into place, or because the client may have some changes to the design, Revit is meant to be modified very easily. And we will demonstrate that. I'm going to be demonstrating that second method because I believe it's going to be the most proficient to move the walls into the correct spot, which means I'm going to look on page 6-29, figure 6-3.5, and I'm going to draw the walls approximately where I see them in the plan. Starting from left to right, I'm going to start placing this one that is near the mullion on the curtain wall, drawing it down to the grid line, and then going over to the left. This wall will continue to extend down to meet other walls, but we'll be able to fix that later. Now I'll continue drawing the walls in. We've got some rectangles, which I can either draw a rectangle, or under my draw tools, I could select the rectangle tool and just draw those in. Looks like the left side of it starts on this column and grid area, and then there's another one to the left of that, which will end on the other grid. Making my way to the bottom, there's a wall that starts on this grid, goes over, eventually is going to accept this wall up here that we started with, goes past it a little, and then it is going to get near this column area. I can already tell that my walls are very off because I'm not going to have much length right here to bring it towards this column at the 135-degree angle. So I'm just going to go over to about here, and then I'm going to make the angle starting at the column for easier cleanup. It calls it out as a 135-degree angle, which means that I can also start at this point and just go up 45 degrees, and then another vertical wall down here, which will die into the side of the wall. And I believe that is all of the walls poorly placed into the view. And that's all right. That's where we're going to make our adjustments later. Let's try and get the form of the walls in their correct positions, and then we'll worry about the particular dimensions. This wall needs to go down further, so I'm going to select that wall, grab the drag end on it, and drag that down to meet the other wall. These two walls need to meet, so I'm going to use the Trim tool under the Modify tab, and I'm going to trim out those two walls. And now we've got our general forms in. Get these walls in their correct spots, we're going to want to dimension them, just like they have it in the book on page 6-29. All of the dimension tools are under the Annotate tab, and they take up this entire left side of the ribbon. However, we're going to pretty much be sticking with the Aligned tool today, and that Align Dimension is not only available here, but it's also always available in the Quick Access toolbar as well. So you could select either of those when you're doing your dimensioning today. Before we dimension the walls, we're going to want to check what part of the walls are being dimensioned. Typically in a construction document set like this, if you are given existing drawings, they would try and provide a note to you to tell you which part of the wall is being dimensioned. But if we look closely at the drawing on page 6-29, it appears that they are just going to the centers of the walls for the interior parts of the wall. And then on the right side of page 6-29, you'll see that dimension that says 15 feet from the interior wall to the exterior wall is dimensioning to the interior face of the wall against the curtain wall system. So right up here. The last trick we'll need whenever we're placing these dimensions or selecting items in Revit, when we get to that point where we need to do that 15-foot dimension, when I hover over the area that I'm wanting to reference, it's trying to select a different part of the wall. We can either tell in the options the dimension to reference a different part of the wall, or if we didn't have that going, we could have hovered over the area that we wanted and then clicked Tab until it cycled through to the option that we want, which is just the interior face of that exterior wall hosting this curtain wall system. One last cleanup right here, dragging this to the end, and now we can get our dimensions going. I'm going to try and keep the dimensions in one singular string for easy cleanup and modification of the dimension strings. So I'm going to first start with this vertical set of dimensions, the 4 foot, 11 foot, 5 foot, and 15 foot. That is going to start in the center of this horizontal wall up here. It's going to go down to the top of our rectangle. It'll go to the bottom of our rectangle. It'll go to the center of the horizontal wall on the bottom. And then it will end at that end point, which I'll need to click Tab because I don't have the proper location line for the dimension string going, and I will select. In a lot of programs, you'd usually just have your dimension string placed now, but Revit does require one more click. After you have selected all the items that you want to dimension, you need to select the spot that you want the dimension string to go, and in trying to recreate the exact same conditions that I see in the book, even placement of the dimension string, I'm going to place it about here. Make sure you click in a blank white space, otherwise you will continue to add more items to your selection or remove them. And then I will end the dimension tool for now so that I can get into just moving these items around, and then we can add dimensions on the other items later. This is where the revise instantly of Revit comes into play. When you want to adjust these dimensions to be the correct dimension, you'll need to select one of the items that the dimension string is referencing, and then you simply click onto the number of the dimension and tell it what you want it to be, and it will adjust those elements. Because the dimension string starts from the exterior wall down here and not the exterior wall up here, I'm going to start from the bottom and making my movements up. Otherwise, when I start with this wall, I'm not going to be sure if this 13-foot 1 dimension, or yours may be different, is actually correct. So starting at the bottom, I don't want to move the exterior wall. The core and shell of the building is set. So I'm going to want to come up to this horizontal wall here, select it, and tell it to be that 15 feet. I can already tell that this wall is going to go up into this horizontal wall of these two rectangular walls. So I am going to move this up first so that we don't get a bunch of error messages. And I'll just scoot this one up as well. So now I will select this horizontal wall. Don't be thrown off by the temporary dimensions, sometimes graphically going over each other. Make sure that you are selecting the dimension for that horizontal wall down here. Because I'm selecting this wall, when I change this dimension, this wall will be the one that moves, which is what we want. So regardless of what your dimension ended up being based on your location, I would like you to select on that dimension and tell it to be the 15 feet. Revit does assume feet, so we could just type in 15, or you could type in 15 feet, and it will move that wall to make it be 15 feet. It'll do that math for you to figure out what that dimension needs to be, and now we've got a nice, more representative of what they were providing for us edge and corner over here. Continuing to make our way up, we don't want to click on this dimension yet, because if we were to adjust this number, it would adjust this horizontal wall back, up, or down, which this wall is set. So we need to move up to our next horizontal wall, select the dimension, refer to the plan where it says 5 feet, and change it to 5 feet. Continuing up to the next horizontal wall, selecting it, selecting the dimension, and setting it to 11 feet. And then finally ending on the upper horizontal wall, which is actually 4 feet away. Now we can add in our other dimensions, but I do know that these walls here and here are supposed to line up, and I know that these walls are here and here are supposed to line up, so logically we can just align those for now so that we have less of a headache when we are trying to fix our walls locations. So I'm going to come up to the Modify tab, and I'm going to use the Align tool. When you use the Align tool, it is a 2-click process unless you have multiple alignment going. Your first click is going to be the item that I like to call in the correct spot, so the item that you are not wanting to move. And then the second click is going to be the item that you want to move to that line location. So I'm going to hover over this wall. It is by default wanting to select the horizontal wall's upper and lower faces, which is fine as long as we can click on those same spots on the other wall. So I'm going to pick one of those. In my case, I'm going to select the exterior upper part of this interior wall, which means I just need to click on that same spot on the other wall, and it will align those. I will do the same for the bottom now. I'll click on the lower part, which means I just need to click on the lower part of the other wall. You'll see that just as helpful as the dimensions that they provide are, graphically we're just going to have to rely on some elements as well. Another example of that is this vertical wall. You'll see that there is no dimension to set the location of where this wall is going to be, but graphically we can see that it is centered on this mullion. So we're going to use that Align tool again to select the center of that mullion and then the center of that wall. This horizontal wall doesn't have a dimension because it was simply just centered on the grid line. So many of these walls that are centered on the grid line, you will likely not see a dimension for, because that is the implied graphical dimension location of those walls. Same with down here. This wall is supposed to line up with the edge of the wall, so I'm going to use that Align tool, and I'm going to align from the edge of the wall to the edge of the wall. Now let's get those dimensions in horizontally, or on page 6-29's case, vertically, so that we can adjust the rest of these walls that aren't graphically set. So I'm going to get that dimension tool going, align dimension specifically, and I'm going to get in those two 10-foot dimensions as well as that 5'2" dimension on the page. That is going to bring me from this vertical wall to this vertical wall, and then to the edge of this, and then to the grid line of this wall. And I will place that, and then while I've got the dimension tool going, I'm going to get in the location for this wall as well. Let's make those adjustments. Starting with this wall, we obviously don't want to move our grid lines. Our engineers are going to tell us the locations of those, or possibly our architects, so we don't want to mess with those. But we can adjust where the interior walls are going to go based on those. And in this case, we need it to be 5'2" away. So I'm going to select that wall, and I'm going to tell it to be 5'2". Revit assumes feet, but if you put a space between the two, it will assume inches for the second value. As a note on this, because this is important, you can do feet, space, inches, just like this. You can also put in feet and inch marks. We're going to select that wall, and we could do 5'2". Revit assumes feet, but if you put a space between two numbers, it will assume that the second number is going to be inches. So with that 5'2" set, I'm going to press enter, and that will adjust the wall accordingly. We all probably had different numbers there, but after moving it to the 5'2", the wall will adjust to where it's supposed to go. This vertical wall over here is in the correct place because it is on the grid line and on the column, so we'll want to work our way from right to left here to adjust to those 10 feet marks. So I'm going to select this vertical wall and ensure that this number, not the temporary dimension, but this dimension is set to the 10 feet. And then come over to this vertical wall and ensure that it is also set to the 10 feet. That put all of our west walls in the correct locations. In the following steps, which should take about a half hour or so, I would like you to go to page 6-30 and move to the east side of the first floor of the building and get in those interior walls using the same techniques. When you are done with that, you will move on to level 2 and you will do the same thing. On level 2, they have set an underlay, which shows a representation of the walls that are appearing on the first floor that we will be able to use later to make drawing some of our building elements easier. But for now, they are just going to be extra line work that is going to make things confusing. So please turn that off. On page 6-31, they discuss this on step 9. But we will essentially ensure that nothing is selected on level 2. We'll scroll down in our properties until we get into the underlay area, and you will ensure that the range base level is not showing level 1, it is showing none, which will clean up our view a lot for us. When you're drawing the walls on this level, you will use the same wall type, but you do want to ensure that your walls are going up to the roof level. As this is only a 2-story building, it will not go to a level 3, it will go to the roof. Use the same techniques that we used on level 1 to get level 2 completed, and then when you are done, we will move on to doors. One last technique in the wall areas before we move on to that they talk about on page 6-33 is using the equalize tool when you're not necessarily concerned about the actual size of a room, when you're not actually concerned about the size of a set of rooms, you just simply want them to be equal. On page 6-32, they're going to show you that you're going to have 3 offices that are going to be in this area. I'm not going to draw them exactly correctly. I'm just going to simply get in the walls for the most part so that I can show you the technique. But you'll get to a point where your walls will essentially look like this, and then you will dimension them as requested. But instead of worrying about what the actual dimension is going to be, you're simply going to come up and click on the EQ button on the dimension, which you can either click on if that was the last dimension you placed, or if you select the dimension tool and you click that EQ button, it will equalize the distance between those offices. Once you've completed that, we'll move on to the doors part. The doors portion of the exercise starts on page 6-37, but once again, I advise that you check on page 6-38 and 6-39 for the next half hour or so while you're placing the doors to ensure that they're placed in their correct spot. Doors are a very simple tool as they just place like a component where you just start the tool and click where you want it to go. However, you will need to ensure that you are placing doors on a wall in Revit, and in life, doors cannot simply just float into the middle of nowhere. So when you get that door tool going, if you hover over areas that the door doesn't like, it's going to give you the angry symbol. And if you hover over a wall, it's going to tell you how it's going to place that door. Just like with walls, when I place doors, I don't focus too much on the exact dimensioning unless the temporary dimension happens to be referencing parts of the wall and door that are relevant to the placing of the door. But I will ensure the orientation is correct. And I will demonstrate that when I go to place my first door. But also, as with walls, ensure that you have as much of the door information set as you can before you actually place it so you don't have to go back and make a bunch of modifications. So on page 6-37, they tell us to start the door tool. We're going to be using the single flush 36x80. And for the double doors, we'll be using the double flush 72x84. We'll be using the single flush 36x84. And then in addition to that, we'll be using the 72x84 for all of our double door situations. You'll see that there is not going to be any dimensions placed for the doors, so many of the doors are just going to be placed as best as you can visually see. Like on page 6-38, the bottom left room, you'll see the door is sort of floating in the middle of the space, so just use your best judgment to place it into the correct location based on where the book is. However, for the doors that are placed closer against the walls, like you see demonstrated in this center office, after we are done placing all the doors, you will need to go back and make adjustments to ensure that the door is 4 inches away from the wall, from the back of the door to the wall. Let's demonstrate all that on this center area. I'm going to ensure that the door is flipping into the room, which I can control by hovering on the upper or lower part of the wall, and I'm going to ensure that the door is a right-hand door flipping into the room, which if it was not in that correct position, I could use the space bar to flip that while I'm placing the door. I can't get that 4 inches right now, so I'm just going to do my best to just place it, and then I will end the tool. It is advised that you just place all your doors before adjusting it, but I'd like to demonstrate all of these methods in one room. So let's get that dimension tool going, and then select the edge of the door and the edge of the wall. It's wanting to select the center of the wall, so I'm going to tab until it selects that interior part of the wall, and then I will place that dimension string. Just like with the wall movement, you can select that door and move it to that 4-inch dimension. You'll notice that Revit does not show the frame of the door, so this 4 inches is going to accommodate for the 2-inch frame around the doors that's not being displayed, as well as the as well as the other 2 inches for the framing. Now we did have one other option for our dimensions here. If our temporary dimensions aren't acting the way that we want, we can actually adjust them. So I'm going to get that door tool going again, and I'm going to place a door over in this office. You'll see that you will likely need to change your flip direction if you stayed with the default right-hand door. So I'm going to click the spacebar, and I'm going to place the door again over in this office area. Except this time I'm going to select the door, and I'm just going to adjust the temporary dimensions on how they're acting so I don't have to place a more permanent dimension in the room, which we would likely not display in this view. So I'm going to grab the grip on this left part of the temporary dimension, and I'm going to drag it to the right side of the wall. It's not wanting to snap to it, so I'm going to click Tab and then let go so that it drops on that part of the wall. For the door, you can do the same thing of dragging it to its edge, but you can also click on that grip and it will cycle between those common locations. This method does also work with walls. So once I get my temporary dimension referencing the right side of the wall on this door and the left side of this door, I can do that same method of just telling the temporary dimension to be set to that 4 inches. Using these techniques, please go around and place all of the doors that you see on page 6-38 and 6-39. Again, the 2 doors you will use will be the 36 by 84 for any single doors and 72 by 84 double flush for any double doors. Make sure you also go up to the 2nd floor to place those as well. When you've completed adding in your doors, that will bring us to the last section of the book, which is adding in our rooms on page 6-40. The most common method you'll likely come across when placing rooms, in my experience, has been that you will start the room tool, which is different from tagging a room. We have to tell the rooms that they are a room first. So we're going to come up to the room tool, and you'll typically just start putting in the rooms and then name them later. But if you recall in our previous chapter, we actually went through and put in all of our rooms, which we can see listed here. So it's going to be a lot less work for us in this chapter because we front-loaded that work in the previous chapter. When you place these rooms, they are actually going to retain actual information when you're placing them, which means that it is going to know the square foot, the volume, and the perimeters of the room as long as you set your constraints correctly. So let's ensure that the properties of the room are accurate. We want to ensure that tag on placement is placed because we don't simply want it to just place a room. We also want it to place this tag talking about that room. We're going to want to change the default room tag to also tell us the area while it's placing it. And we'll want to tell it to look up to level 2 with no offset. That way it'll ensure that it is measuring the volume of the room starting from level 1 and just going up to level 2. When you go to place your rooms in level 2, make sure you set it to roof with no offset. Let's start by placing a room. Down here is our large conference / boardroom. So instead of just placing it and having to name it later, as I mentioned, we could come up to our list of rooms, go down until we find the large conference room, go down until we find the large conference room, and then place that room. It will know what its name and number is because we already told it that earlier. It's already going to know what its name is because we told it that earlier, and then it will display the square footage of the room that we are ending up placing it into, which is going to be our 426 here, and go ahead and place that. If you find that your area is significantly different, make sure that you check the location of your walls from the earlier chapter, but if you're a square foot or 2 off, that shouldn't be a big issue. Before we go to place the rest of these rooms, I do recommend another little trick to make things easier. You'll see that after a room has been placed, it does not necessarily continue to indicate which of those rooms have been selected, like it shows here. It would be nice if we can get a filter that kind of displayed like this while we are placing our rooms to make sure that we got them all. So we're going to turn on a filter that we will temporarily keep on by going into our visibility graphics overrides, or you could come over to your properties with nothing selected and select visibility graphics overrides. And here we're going to go down to our room category, and we're going to open up the subcategories of room and select interior fill. When we're done with this process, be sure to come back to uncheck this in the same method. Otherwise, you will have to deal with your rooms constantly lighting up blue in your construction document sets. But it's going to be very helpful while we're going around to place our rooms. So using page 6-42 and 6-43, go around and place your different rooms that are bound within your walls. I will demonstrate one more. I'm going to come up to the Room tool, and I'll do the medium conference room that's just to the left of this. So I will select medium conference room from this list, and when I go to place it, I'm actually going to try and use this aligning line to make tags line up with each other. As you get towards the end of placing your rooms, you are going to notice that there are some odd conditions where we're going to need to place a room that is not bound by walls. Just as you've likely been in a house where separation between the kitchen and the dining room didn't have a wall, but there was just an implied separation between those two spaces, we can create that same condition inside of Revit as well. It would be a major stifle to our interior design process if we had to draw walls to separate rooms that were different purposes from each other. For example, if you look on page 6-45, you're going to see that this area of the common space is a waiting room and a lobby, and then up here is the designated reception area. In order to tell these spaces that they are separate from the rest of your spaces, without drawing walls, you will use the Room Separator tool, which is up here near the Room tool. This simply acts like a line, but it does also bound rooms within each other. So I'm going to draw the approximate shape of the waiting room. I'll adjust the height of this horizontal line, but I am going to ensure that the vertical line is lined up with the edge of the curtain wall glass. If when you drew that, it didn't show you the aligning lines or you missed that, you can just come up to modify and align to ensure that the edge of the curtain wall lines the edge of this room separator line. It is also important to note that on page 6-45, they do graphically display the room separator lines as dashed, and I don't know why. They must have overwrote it or something, but just be aware that typically when you place the room separator lines, they will come up as solid, like mine are on screen here. I'm going to also place the dimension edges for the reception desk, ensuring that it is lining up with the corner of wall and the corner of the wall, and I'll have to use my aligning line, my aligning tool for here, and the trim tool for the edges, and then I just need to adjust the location of this horizontal line. Let's see if I can get the temporary dimensions to let us get our locations that we want, which it is going to the room separator line, but I will need to adjust this location by dragging it up and tabbing to select it to the wall. If modifying these temporary dimensions to get them into the correct spot is too much of a challenge now, which I completely understand, just get that dimension tool going and dimension from that aligning line to the edge of the wall, which you'll need to click tab to select if you don't have the correct location line going. But I will ensure that this is actually going up the 11'5". And now when we go to place the room tool in those areas, it will separate them out. So if I go to waiting and lobby and place in here, and then I can go up to the reception and place it separate from the rest of the rooms. You now have all of the skills necessary in order to place your walls, your doors, and your rooms, but I did want to give one more piece of advice because they don't go over this in the chapter, and I feel that it is important. Let's say, for example, that this room right here was an office, and then this room right here was simply the closet for that office, and you wanted to display that the square foot of both of these rooms should be combined to be the square foot of the office space. Just as a room or a space can be separate from other spaces by supplementarily adding in the room separator lines, you can also tell a wall that it does not bound a room. So if I was to come up here, which do not do this because this is going to be incorrect placement of the rooms and designations, if I were to place this room here, you will see that this room is now accounting for this space. If I was wanting it to account for this space, because let's say, for example, this door went into that room and this was simply the closet for that space, you can tell this wall that it does not bound the room. So when you uncheck that, you'll notice that this 215 and the square footage for this is going to also account for this left room. When you have completed adding in all of the rooms, you are done with the chapter. One thing I did forget, I apologize, is you will need to update the numberings for the rooms as well. So as you go through and place the room tags for level 1 and level 2, please go back and ensure that the rooms numbering are matching the numbering that we have in our schedules and on those pages that you're going to be checking when you're placing the rooms. So our large conference room over here is actually supposed to be, I'm going to go back to page 6-42 and 6-43, and we'll see that the large conference room is actually number 220, which you will see reflected in the schedule.